I have told this story exactly twice. Once to my wife, the night we came home, and once to my grandson years afterward when he was old enough to understand why I still kept the photograph on the mantle. I'm not a man who collects moments. I laid bricks for 40 years, and a wall is the same wall whether you remember setting it or not. But that afternoon in the South Court of Caverly Palace, I saw something I have never been able to put down, and I think now I never will. We had come for the boy. Davy was 9 that summer, and his mother had saved the better part of 2 years for the trip to the capital. The investitures were open to the public then, on the long July days when the King of Norvin pinned the star on whichever men the realm had decided to honor. You stood behind a low rope at the edge of the court, under the lime trees, and you watched. Davy did not care about the star or the men who would wear it. He had come for the guards. He had a painted soldier at home in a red coat, and someone had told him the real ones never moved, not for anything, and he meant to test that with his own eyes. The sentry nearest us stood at the foot of the marble steps, red wool tunic buttoned to the throat in heat that had the rest of us fanning ourselves with the program. A tall black bearskin, white gloves, a rifle held against his shoulder as if it weighed nothing, though I had held a rifle once in my younger years and knew it weighed plenty after the first hour. He did not move, not when a wasp circled his collar, not when the band struck up and 100 people surged against the rope. His eyes were fixed on some point above all our heads, and his face had the set, scoured calm of a man who has decided, completely, not to be moved. Davy crept as close to the rope as he dared and stared up at him for the better part of 10 minutes, waiting for a blink, a twitch, anything. He got nothing. Then his mother called him back, and as he turned away, deflated, the guard did the smallest thing. His eyes came down. Just for half a second, no more, they found the boy, and the corner of his mouth moved a fraction of an inch. Not a smile, nothing you could have photographed, but a thing one person gives to another to say, I saw you, I know you were watching asterisk. Then his eyes went back up and the statue was a statue again. Davy nearly fell over with delight. I tell you that small thing now because it matters later. There was a man inside that stillness. He had simply decided we did not need to see him. The man of the hour arrived not long after. I had read about Conrad Mallory the way you read about men like that, in the corner of a newspaper, on a poster, on the side of a building. The richest man in the realm, they said. He had started with one ship and ended owning the harbors. In the last few years he had become a charitable man, or had become known as one, which is not always the same thing. He had a foundation that put his name over the doors of hospitals and schoolrooms, and it was for that, the program told us, that the king meant to honor him today. The Star of Norving, the realm's gratitude made into a thing you could wear on your chest. He came up the court with a half-dozen people trailing him, and you could see at once that he was a man who had not been told asterisk, no asterisk in a very long time. He moved as though the crowd were furniture that had agreed to assemble in his honor. A young woman walked beside him with a small camera, and it was plain that her whole job that afternoon was to make pictures of Conrad Mallory being a great man. He stopped near our stretch of rope, a few feet from the sentry, and the camera came up. And it was here that something turned in him. I have thought about it many times since, and I believe the trouble was that the camera found the guard more interesting than it found Mallory. The guard, by simply standing there, was the better picture, and Mallory could not abide that. "Get one of me with the toy soldier," he said. He stepped in close and struck a pose, one arm flung up beside the bearskin, grinning for the lens. The sentry did not move. Mallory looked at the picture on the little camera screen and was not satisfied. He wanted the soldier to do something. He wanted, I think, to own the moment the way he owned the harbors. "Smile then," he said to the guard, and laughed, and a few of the people around him laughed because that is what people do around men like that. The guard's eyes stayed where they were. Mallory's grin thinned. He reached out and flicked the brass buttons of the tunic with 2 fingers, the way you might flick a horse to make it shy. Nothing. He tapped the underside of the bearskin so it nudged forward on the man's brow. Nothing. By now the laughter around him had gone quiet and uncertain, and more cameras had come up along the rope, because a crowd can feel when a thing is going wrong even before it knows what the thing is. "You're allowed to react, you know," Mallory said, lower now, the grin gone. I asked nicely, "Do you know who I am? Half the men your king is honoring today couldn't have built what I built, so smile for the camera, soldier." The sentry stood as he had stood all afternoon, eyes forward, the rifle still and the white glove still and the red wool drinking in the July sun. And I watched Conrad Mallory understand, in real time, that all his money could not buy him this man's eyes for one single second, and I watched that understanding curdle into something I did not like. He drew his hand back and slapped the guard across the face. It was not a tap. The crack of it carried over the band. The bearskin rocked and the man's head turned with the blow, and a thin line of red opened at the corner of his lip. Davy's mother put her hand over the boy's eyes. The whole court seemed to draw one breath and hold it. And the guard did not move. I have tried for years to describe what that was like, and the closest I can come is this. It was like watching a stone wall be struck by a wave. The head came back to center. The eyes climbed back to that point above us all. The blood ran down to his jaw and he let it. He did not raise the rifle. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at the man who had hit him. He simply went back to being the most still thing in that whole loud court. And in doing so he made Conrad Mallory, standing there with his hand still half raised, look like exactly what he was. Because here is what the slap had done, and what I do not think Mallory ever planned. There were perhaps 40 cameras up along that rope by then, and every one of them had it. Not a brawl. Not two men trading blows where a crowd's sympathy splits and gets confused. A powerful man in a fine suit striking a young man who had sworn an oath not to strike back, and the young man simply taking it, with blood on his face and his eyes on the king's house. There is no way to make that picture say anything but the truth. What happened next I did not fully understand until the next day's papers laid it out, but I saw the shape of it from where I stood. On the marble steps above us, the king of Norvin had been watching. He had come out early, ahead of his time, the way I later learned he sometimes did, to see the court fill. He had seen the whole of it, and when the slap landed, the king did not shout and he did not hurry. He turned to the officer beside him and said something none of us could hear, and the officer went down the steps at a fast walk, and 2 more guards came in from the wings, moving, ordinary men, not statues, and they did not lay a hand on Conrad Mallory. They simply stood between him and the sentry and asked him, with great courtesy, to come away. He went, blustering, telling them who he was, telling them what he had built. The young woman with the camera had lowered it and would not look at him. The Star of Norvin was given out that afternoon to the men whose names were on the program. Conrad Mallory's name was not called. The king came down the steps himself, when the ceremony was done, and stood for a moment before the sentry who had held the foot of his stairs all through the heat. He said something to him, quietly, that I was too far away to hear. Then he reached up and with his own hand he touched the man's shoulder once and went back inside. By nightfall it was everywhere. By the next morning the foundation that put Mallory's name over the doors had a different name, because the men who funded it had read the same papers I had and seen the same picture, and not one of them wished to be the man standing beside Conrad Mallory now. The harbors were still his. The money was still his. But the thing he had come to Caverly to collect, the realm's gratitude, the right to be called a great man, that he would never have, and he had thrown it away himself, with one swing of his own hand, in front of 40 cameras and a king. I learned the guard's name later. It was in one of the papers alongside the picture, Samuel Reed. He had served on a hard frontier before he ever wore the red wool, in a place the article named and I have since forgotten, and the men who had been there with him said the same thing in slightly different words. That Reed was the steadiest man any of them had known, that he was the one you wanted beside you when everything came apart, because nothing made him flinch. I believe it. I saw the proof of it on a July afternoon, with a wasp at his collar, and a rich man's hand across his face. People say the power that day belonged to Conrad Mallory. He had the ships and the money and the name on the buildings, and the guard had a rifle he was not permitted to use and an oath that bound his hands. But I was there, and I will tell you that the power in that court belonged entirely to the man who did not move. Mallory could make people laugh and make people afraid and make people pretend, but he could not make one quiet sentry betray his discipline, and when he failed at that, he had nothing left to swing but his own ruin. Davy is grown now with a boy of his own. He does not remember the slap, his mother having spared him that, but he remembers the guard who looked down at him for half a second and let a small boy know he had been seen. That is the part I tell him, the part about the man inside the stillness, who chose what was worth moving for, and who taught a whole court without saying a word, that a man who will not be provoked is the hardest man in the world to beat. I keep the photograph on the mantel still, not the famous one with the blood and the raised hand. The other one, a stranger sent it to me years later, having seen me in the crowd. It is just the sentry at the foot of the steps before any of it happened, perfectly still in the heat, and a small boy in front of him gazing up. You would never know, to look at it, what that man was capable of holding. That, I have come to think, is the whole of it.